Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, continuing on the discussion of how to transform the environment around us, including dealing with this new Ontario sex education curriculum, we're going to go into part 2 of this presentation. In part 2 of this presentation, I'm going to talk about what we want to have in an Islamic sex education curriculum for public school children. So, what essential elements, what are the building blocks of this new Islamic sex education curriculum? And we're talking specifically about public school children. We're not talking about the private system, which is a whole different story. We want specifically for the people who have their children attending public school. So our goal is to provide an Islamic sex education curriculum for public school children to be taught in an Islamic environment by qualified teachers. And I'd like you to look at those 3 words. Those are going to be the essential elements of our Islamic sex education program for children. And before I get into those 3 elements, I'd also like to say we want to provide a building blocks version to be taught by trained parents. You know, you might not like this new Islamic sex education curriculum either. So we want to give you the option of teaching separately, but we do want you to be trained about sex education, and we want you to have an awareness, to certainly develop an awareness of the dangers and hazards your children are facing out there. And if we are serious about properly dealing with the issues of sexuality and gender interaction in our community, then we're going to have to train ourselves. Okay? This might end up being more of a program focused on parents than it is on children. And I want to underline this statement. Sex education and training have to be made an essential element of good parenting. And if you think right now that in this current environment you are qualified to teach your children on matters of sex, I would very much urge you to reconsider very carefully. Okay, so the first essential element of a new Islamic sex education program tailored for public schools is the content that's going into the new curriculum. And we can look to a number of sources for that. We can make surveys for mosques and community centers of parents and soon-to-be parents and get their feedback as to what they want to see taught properly in an Islamic environment. We can consult with our shayukh both locally and internationally. Sheikh Faraz Rabbani is the educational director and instructor at Seeker's Guidance, and he'd be an excellent source on this subject. We need to talk about the legal requirements. So there are some aspects, for example, of LGBTQ+ that we need to discuss. We need to talk about treating people from these communities with compassion and humanity. And all of these elements would go into a research project, and an appropriate Islamic curriculum would be developed. The second element we want to talk about is an appropriate Islamic environment in which to teach the new sex education curriculum from an Islamic point of view. We can use a number of places. We can use the local mosque, and I know there's a lot of parents who are probably very leery of using the mosque to teach your kids about sex. And I'm going to point out that they're going to learn it from somewhere. And we need to talk about, well, maybe the mosque is better than some other places they could learn it from. We can use a local community center with an appropriate setting. There's a number of Islamic schools, and we can make use of their classrooms. And then this one I'm a little leery of, but there may be people who are comfortable with having their children taught by a private individual in their home environment. And again, I am a little leery about that. We want to make sure that such a person would be trustworthy, and we want to underline trustworthiness before we decide to do something like that. And then, of course, we're going to have to talk about Well, we want the boys in one class and the girls in another class. And for some of them, we also want them in the same class to talk about things like valuing and respecting each other and things that are appropriate to a mixed class. Okay, and the third and most important element of a good Islamic sex education program is the people who will be teaching it. And I want to emphasize this first point: they need to be trustworthy. Remember, you're trusting them to teach your children about sex and sexuality. We want them to be trained, and we want them to be paid. This is not going to be a voluntary job. We want them to be professionals, not amateurs. We want them to go through a full licensing program, probably a background check. Yes, it can be part of another job. If your teacher is a social worker who takes this on as part of his work as a social worker, that's totally okay. We want a man to teach the boys and a woman to teach the girls. And we want to keep our teachers up to date on both the Islamic ethos and the local Ontario currents. We want them to understand sexuality from an Islamic point of view, and we want them also to keep up to speed with what's going on in the environment around them. And again, I want to emphasize that if you as a parent look at the Islamic sex education curriculum that would be upcoming and you decide that's not appropriate for your children, if you've looked at these slides and you decide that's not the way you want your children to learn about sex, we will have a version of the curriculum that you can teach yourself. But I want to emphasize that you have to get trained and be knowledgeable about the issues that they're facing out there. And don't make the mistake of thinking you know how to teach without training. So this concludes part 2 of this presentation, and inshallah stay tuned for part 3.